everybody for coming in days of Zoom fatigue and deadlines and encroaching examining, etc. But very excited really to be chairing this launch of a very important book on Peruvian cinema. And in fact, the first book published in English to provide a study of Peruvian cinema over the last 2 decades. I'm not actually going to say very much more about the book myself at this point, because we're honoured to have both editors with us today, and they're going to introduce it themselves. But I'm going to introduce them briefly before they begin their presentation. So starting off with Sarah Barrow, who's Professor of Latin American Film and Culture at the University of East Anglia. Sarah is well known to many of us at Cambridge. She's been a very significant figure in the field of Latin American cinema over a number of years. Her research focuses on Peruvian cinema and culture, particularly the ways in which cinema presents but also contests hegemonic power. And as well as publishing on the work of individual filmmakers, she's also studied Lima's Film Festival and different questions of production and distribution. Her monograph, which is called Contemporary Peruvian Cinema, History, Identity, Violence, explored cinematic responses to the armed conflict in Peru, and it won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award in 2019. And then also presenting, speaking to us today is Cynthia Vich, who's Associate Professor of Spanish and Latin American Culture at Fordham University in New York City. And she is the author of Indigenismo de Vanguardia en el Perú, un estudio sobre el boletín Titicaca from 2000, as well as several articles on Peruvian indigenista writers and other subjects. And her most recent work focuses on the cinematic representations of urban spatiality in a number of recent Peruvian films. So I'm going to hand over to them now to guide us through the structure, scope, themes, etc. of the book that they've just brought out.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Joanna. Apologies for my over-enthusiastic use of the screen there. I shall be more careful as we go through. Thank you so much to the Cambridge Centre for Latin American Studies for inviting us to give this presentation today. It really does mean a great deal to us to have the opportunity to do this as part of such a dynamic context for the discussion of Latin American culture, society and politics. We appreciate the Centre as a really prestigious, important, valuable and impactful centre for everything to do with Latin America. Thank you in particular to Julie Coimbra for all the organisation and communication and support and encouragement as ever, and to you, Joanna, for hosting and chairing today. It's a real honour to be in your company. This is a really welcome opportunity to look back on our book project and to mark its publication amidst a global pandemic and multiple lockdowns. We've been working on this for 3 years now and kind of negotiating our way through this period. The project, in fact, began 3 years ago when Cynthia and our colleague Karolina Sydniski-Cole and one of our contributors approached me at the LASA annual conference in 2018 at Barcelona about contributing to a co-edited book on Peruvian cinema of the 21st century. Having all just completed projects on aspects of Latin American culture of the late 20th century, we were incredibly aware that the new millennium had brought with it an explosion of new filmmakers and cultural producers who had so many more topics and subjects to cover and modes of representation to explore that our previous work just hadn't had time to look at. So I'm just going to move forward here. A decision was made, therefore, to begin this book and to organise it according to the principles of the dynamics of the film market, an area we then debated for quite a while, and actually throughout the project, and while we've been translating it as well into Spanish. And we've continued to do this during this work for the University of Lima Press, which has just been submitted. In this way, we wanted to show how Peruvian cinema cannot and should not be pigeonholed into any single stereotype or any stereotype whatsoever. Just because the films from Peru that we normally get to see in the UK or the US or anywhere outside of Peru or Latin America are the festival type films does not mean that that's all there is. For us, the market ecology then was and remains an important part of the sense of diversity that we're aiming to reveal and to highlight with this book project. So the book is divided into two parts. The first of which focuses on the market dynamics of Peruvian cinema, as you can see here, in the context of neoliberalism, which Cynthia is going to speak about in the next section. So we had three subcategories for that first part. Our big budget film for local entertainment subsection comprises critical approaches to market-orientated films produced by national companies such as Tondero and Big Bang Films, whose main objective is to develop for-profit entertainment cinema and whose audiences are centered in Lima and other major cities in Peru. Regional low-budget drama comprises of films made by individual directors who are shown mostly in local venues outside Lima and where profit, albeit quite low, is one of the main guiding forces. Regional films in general have been acknowledged as the most significant development in Peruvian cinema since the late 1990s. And in this section, we focus on those regional films with a specific eye on commercial success and a local audience. And then in the third kind of subcategory of this area, we look at cinema aimed primarily at the festival circuit, including Lima's own prestigious film festival, which benefits from those festivals' main funding initiatives as well. Due to very limited state support from Peru, the dependence on the support offered by these events to global and world cinema producers has been invaluable, though not without consequence in terms of certain expectations of festival curators and audiences. The films in this third section further highlight the tension between international visibility and lack of local or national recognition. In spite of the prizes awarded by those festivals, these films often struggle to gain the confidence of national exhibitors who seem reluctant to include them in their schedules. As a result, apart from the limited funding awarded by the state, Peru has no other way to support the development of this type of film production, nor to develop an audience that appreciates it. The second overarching category for our book focuses on films, filmmakers, and film practices that are situated outside of the dynamics of the market and comprises films that refuse to be understood, presented, or experienced as commodities inserted in circuits of profit or prestige. As such, they display an antagonistic relationship towards that type of cinema that depends on market forces, and they inhabit alternative spaces where they make different demands of their spectators. Focusing on practices that emerge from a different logic and understanding of the role of film, the studies included in this section allow us to make visible that part of Peruvian cinema that often otherwise remains unaccounted for. So here I'm going to pass over to Cynthia, who's going to speak a little bit more about this underpinning notion of neoliberalism.
Good afternoon. It is indeed an honor for me to be here today. So I would like to start by thanking the Center of Latin American Studies at the University of Cambridge, in particular, Julie Coimbra, for organizing the event. And of course, my special thanks to you, Joanna, for your interest in our book and for taking the time to chair this event. So I would like to begin by emphasizing that our book examines the particularities of cinematic development in very close dialogue with Peru's socioeconomic and political processes. In that sense, the interplay between the cinematic and the societal is critical. Following this, we frame the upsurge of Peruvian cinema during the last 20 years as tied to the official end of the armed conflict that went from 1980 to 2000, and to the country's subsequent reinvention under the Fujimori regime within a neoliberal agenda that inserted it into the global marketplace. So we took as our point of departure that neoliberalism is not only a rationality implemented and mandated from above, or limited to being an economic and political model, but also a cultural regime. This does not mean, as it is sometimes believed, that the states withdraws from its governing role. What happens instead is that the state transforms the way it governs. What is called neoliberal governmentality is a technology of power through which the state, through a wide array of cultural repertoires, disseminates distinct social mandates built upon the ethics and practice of entrepreneurship. Naturalizing competition and individual merit as the guiding principles of society, citizens are called to become model participatory subjects of a nation building project by becoming what is called entrepreneurs of themselves. This regime of social existence that Veronica Gago has called neoliberalism from below has become deeply rooted in the subjectivities and tactics of the everyday life of Peruvian citizens. So in the specific case of Peru, for example, what Gisela Canepa has called the epic of entrepreneurship is presented as an opportunity for all, reinforcing but also transforming the heroic narrative that since the mid-20th century understood migration as the first step to economic prosperity. Subsequently, the social, cultural, and economic transformations brought by migration were resignified in terms of the vitalist pragmatics that characterizes neoliberalism from below as a network of practices and knowledge that has calculation as its structuring matrix, and which functions as the engine of a powerful popular economy. So from this perspective, the migrant is no longer a marginal subject to the state as it once was, but rather the protagonist of the country's dynamization and economic success through his or her progressive lifestyles and consumption patterns. So because of this massive restructuring role that neoliberalism had in all aspects of Peruvian society, we guided the mapping of our book's essays, considering the relationship that the films analyzed had with market dynamics in terms of their production mechanisms, as well as their intended audiences. So now Sarah is going to describe like the chapters themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. So one of the collective ambitions for this project was to shed light on the diversity of contemporary Peruvian cinema. Our essays cut across a wide range of topics and formats: fiction, documentary, shorts, experimental, commercial, festival, or art cinema, and by filmmakers from many parts of Peru. We really wanted to go beyond the so-called centre and pay homage to those working in film in many other areas, encompassing coast, desert, and beyond, Andean communities and the Amazonian Film School, for example. In so doing, we reached out not only to academics in film and cultural studies, but also to critics, filmmakers, anthropologists, curators, established new voices, male and female, voices from Peru mainly, as well as Peruvians based in the US and in Europe. As previously mentioned, the first part of our book refers to the market dynamics of Peruvian cinema and places it within the context of neoliberalism in Peru, as Cynthia has just outlined. The first category contains 2 essays that explore examples of the so-called big budget for film for local entertainment. So as we mentioned here, Karolina Sidniski's chapter examines factors that have given rise to the success of the romantic comedy through an analysis of some of the most popular films of this genre in the country's recent history, evaluating the ways that these films have contributed to the shaping of Peru's cinematic landscape. In the next chapter, Jeff Middens contextualizes Asumare at the start of the 21st century trend of successful popular comedies within larger historic debates concerning Peruvian national cinema, and considers the way that the aesthetics and ideology of these comedies relate to the nation branding efforts of the campaign known as Marca Peru. There then follow 3 essays on regional low-budget drama, with a focus on filmmaking in the Andean region of Ayacucho. Just double check here that we haven't got the... Yeah, I'm just going to move back to this one, just so we can see those notions again. Emilio Bustamante's chapter analyzes the connections between the Ayacuchean film Bullying Maldito, La Historia de Maria Marimacha, American beef series horror, and the Peruvian legend of Maria Marimacha. It also discusses the film's poster in relation to testimonies of sexual abuse suffered by women in Ayacucho during the internal armed conflict. These trans and extra-textual connections reveal how the film critiques the heteropatriarchal norms of Andean communities. They also speak to the wider context of the violence suffered by women in the region during the 1980s and the 1990s. Martha Cecilia Dietrich uses her skills as a visual anthropologist to look behind the scenes of Ayacuchean cinema in the making, with a focus on the production processes of an unfinished film, assessing the power dynamics of cultural politics, the possibilities and the limitations in articulating an artistic vision, and of the desire to reimagine Ayacuchean identity through fictional storytelling. So I'll just move forward again to the names. Maria Eugenia Ulfe also adopts an anthropological perspective to analyse the conditions, the modes of production, circulation and exhibition of the feature film La Casa Rosada by Palita Ortega Matute. She shows how it recreates the impact of the armed conflict on the everyday lives of Ayacucheans at the time, deploying Hesfeld's concept of cultural intimacy to explore the film's highly artisanal and familial approach to filmmaking, which fostered a distinctive emotional connection with the local audience, triggered by their own memories of the ways that the city of Ayacucho experienced the conflict. There then follows a necessarily, we thought, large section on films aimed primarily at the international festival circuit, including Lima's own prestigious event, a market that has dominated the approach to distribution by Peruvian filmmakers in the last 2 decades. This section contains 8 essays, many of which draw on the theme of memory, a topic that has become almost symbiotic with the very notion of art cinema in the country. I'm not going to go over Cynthia and my own essays because we're going to do that in more detail in a moment, but I'm just going to give you a summary of the other ones in this section. So by focusing on the materiality of the situations presented in the films Paraíso and N.E., Maria Elena Rueda's chapter points out how the director opens his films up to global interpretations without depriving them of their local contextual meaning and weight. Focusing on the agency of spaces and objects in both films, she analyses how these are integral to human interaction and to the resilience of the characters in their attempts to overcome what appear to be hopeless circumstances. Ricardo Bedoya presents 5 short films which deal with memory of the armed conflict, as well as some of the political clashes of recent years between the state and local communities regarding mining activity. He highlights the importance of the short format in that it allows directors to showcase a certain trajectory in terms of market appeal and development of their aesthetic language. In her chapter, Alexandra Hibet identifies 5 so-called blockages of Peruvian memory cinema: the tension between film as industry or art, the difficulty of portraying Andean subjects with integrity, the attempt not to undermine the agency of the victims in the process of representation, the highly centralized Peruvian film industry, and the risks of tackling the topic of political violence in what is still a highly polarized context. Javier Porcel argues that film is the principal way through which literature is now consumed in 21st century Peru. By looking at 3 films based on Alonso Cueto's novels, he analyses the transition between literary and cinematic languages, as well as the treatment of memory in relation to the armed conflict. And in her chapter on La Última Tarde and La Hora Final, Karen Benedo identifies the different approaches to representing the character of the insurgent in Peruvian fiction cinema. So while over half the chapters in this particular section deal with the issue of memory about the armed conflict, the diversity of Peruvian art cinema does embrace multiple other topics that make the local translatable on the global scale. For example, Maria Chiara D'Argenio's contribution discusses the way that slow aesthetics and Aymara language in the use of Huayna have appealed to the tastes of festival audiences worldwide. And she argues that it reframes Andean indigeneity through a focus on intimacy. Daniela Wurst's analysis of 2 shorts by Claudia Llosa combines a discussion about the links between the cinematic and the touristic gazes in their representations of the other, with an exploration of how the neoliberal mandates bring constraints and opportunities to the filmmaker as artist. The second, shorter, but by no means less impactful, in fact, incredibly important part of this book, contains 3 essays about films, filmmakers, and practices that are situated outside the dynamics of the market, i.e., as we heard earlier, those that refuse to be understood, presented, or experienced as commodities, inserted in circuits of profit or prestige. Claudia Arteaga, for example, examines the Escuela de Cine Amazónicos training, production, and circulation processes, and analyzes 2 short films produced by their students. She presents an understanding of cinema as a way of constructing micro-political spheres for building senses of belonging, arguing that these films depart from the usual paradigm of indigenous versus mestizo and modern. In this context, audiovisual language becomes a tool for reflection on questions of identity. And finally, Isabel Seguí's chapter critically approaches independent female-led non-fiction projects through analysis of the work of Diana Castro, creative producer of films and festivals, and Lorena Best, director, teacher, and organizer is the best way to perhaps describe her. Isabel Seguí draws on oral history from a feminist perspective as a method to propose a non-hierarchical film culture, an alternative commercial and art film logic, and a way to challenge male-dominated paradigms. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Cynthia, who's going to give us a more extended version on her chapter on the work of Quispe. Over to you, Cynthia.
Okay, so my chapter belongs to the second overarching category, the films that are outside of the dynamics of the market. So understanding that cinema both participates in, but also contests the neoliberal project, this section showcases the films and the filmmaking practices that locate themselves in opposition to market logics. So in relation to this, my chapter examines type of filmmaking that refuses to be understood, presented, or experienced as a commodity, right? In the chapter is called No Concessions, Aesthetics and Politics in the Cinema of Eduardo Quispe Alarcón. And there I examine the films and counter-hegemonic practices of production, distribution, and exhibition of this main figure of Peruvian experimental cinema. Born in Ayacucho in 1980, but living in Lima from a very young age after his parents migrated to the capital, Quispe Alarcón practices what is known as guerrilla cinema, an extremely low budget, artisanal way of producing, distributing, and exhibiting film. His films do not have any financial support from private or state sources, do not regularly compete in film festivals, do not use professional actors, and are not shown in mainstream theaters. Since 2008, he has directed and produced 6 feature films, sequentially named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. These films are available online for free. You can just type their name and they will pop up, but have also been exhibited in cultural centers, cine clubs, and other non-commercial venues. So placing Quispe Alarcón within an historical and global tradition of anti-hegemonic artists, in my chapter, I discuss the international influences that shape his aesthetic, thematic, and anti-industrial choices in relation to his local activism and to his understanding of the political dimension of cinema as a vehicle of inquiry, resistance, and rehumanization. Against the backdrop of neoliberalism's influence on the way cinema creates and disseminates national imaginaries and models of citizenship that circulate both locally and globally, and in the context of the erosion of the political that defined the first decade of the 21st century, I use this case study to address the wider question of the role played by cinema in either reproducing or questioning the status quo. So due to the limited time I have today, I cannot go in depth in my analysis of this filmmaker's works and activism, but I will simply outline how these two aspects, his films and his activisms, work in sync to reveal his antagonistic stance against that type of cinema that is linked to market forces, and how this positioning emerges from a different logic and understanding of the role of film in society. So in terms of his activism, Quispe Alarcón's role as one of the organizers of the Festival de Cine Independiente in 2011 was crucial. This was the first local initiative to document and institutionalize a type of radical independent filmmaking that until then had been unaccounted for in Peru. As a political act aimed at breaking the field status quo, this festival opened up a dissenting space for developing an alternative culture of low-budget cinema, which rejected the need for state of private funding and was not afraid of alienating audiences with its experimentation. In terms of his films, Quispe Alarcón contests both aesthetically and thematically what he believes are the harmful effects of neoliberalism in cinema culture and in human social behavior. Aesthetically, and inspired by Dogma 95's founding principle of the need to purify filmmaking from the artificiality of technical manipulation, Quispe Alarcón rejects all those industrial resources. For example, high production values, sophisticated post-production editing, elaborate and rigid scripts, and professional acting that in his view transform film into mere spectacle. His films are exercises of aesthetic and technical austerity, which aim to recover and convey the authenticity of spaces, dialogues, and human interactions. For example, in all 6 of them, the absence of artificial lighting means that sometimes people and objects are hard to distinguish. Occasionally, unedited direct sound, like the loud street traffic or the clicking of cups and saucers in a cafe, makes the characters' conversations unintelligible. As a rejection of the intrinsic artificial nature of filmmaking, these formal choices are unavoidably romantic attempts to represent life in its more genuine form. Likewise, the use of one single shot to film the 68-minute-long 3 is in sync with the contemplative principle of slow cinema, becoming an invitation to think about the image. Thematically, Quispe Alarcón denounces the way that Peruvian media, including entertainment and some art house cinema, have represented second-generation young limeños of provincial origin as emblems of those entrepreneurs of themselves celebrated by the Peruvian neoliberal discourse of national achievement. He does so by both presenting characters that are antagonistic to the entrepreneurial spirit and others who are trapped and enslaved by it. For example, a common character throughout his films is the youngster from Peru's emerging middle class who, having had access to education, shows no interest in his own professionalization or insertion into the labor force. Presented as ideologically marginal, this character opposes those others who embody the mandates of entrepreneurial participation that characterize the new sense of citizenship in Peru today. Showing how these youngsters conceive themselves as human capital, Quispe Alarcón highlights how they have internalized a mandate that makes them responsible for the efficient management of their lives. As a critique of this logic of subjugation, Quispe Alarcón shows what he believes is the truth that lies below their performative discourse: loneliness and human disconnection. In his films, many of these young limeños appear isolated, drifting through an urban space that is filmically constructed as an extension of their own uncertainties, unrests, and emotional wanderings. Through a critical exploration of their sociability, their romantic endeavors, their relationship with the urban fabric, and the societal and familial pressures they face, these films provide an alternative and complex portrait of this specific cohort of the Peruvian population. Quispe Alarcón's thematic, aesthetic, and anti-industrial choices are grounded on his belief that cinema's role is to restore individual autonomy in its most essential sense, freeing individuals from neoliberal mandates through cinematic experiences that break up their passivity as spectators, challenge their imagination, and allow them to critically see themselves on screen. In his view, this process has the potential to rehumanize audiences and trigger a socially and politically engaged citizenship. This sense of citizenship will stand as an alternative to the model of performative citizenship mobilized by neoliberalism as a cultural regime in Peru today. So in my chapter, I go into detail about Quispe Alarcón's ideas on how to develop a more democratic, artistically stimulating, and politically engaged cinema culture in Peru, but I cannot expand on those today. I also explain in my chapter in greater detail some of the critical considerations that I have about Quispe Alarcón's work and activism. For reasons of time, I will only mention one here. Putting his films in dialogue with his ideas about the political role of cinema, I believe it is important to acknowledge the significant difficulties of reconciling some of the most radical, artistically experimental elements of Quispe Alarcón's aesthetics with his desire to connect with average people in a non-erudite form. While his films do capture and portray real-life circumstances and genuine, non-artificial characters, capable of interpolating and effectively connecting with a specifically differentiated audience, that is urban middle-class youth, their abstraction, fragmented composition, elliptical narratives, and slow temporal unfolding can be difficult for many to undergo. In this sense, at a practical level, the way his films aesthetically embody his theoretical pronouncements can certainly interfere with his convictions about the need to bridge the gap with the spectator. Inevitably, films like Quispe Alarcón's are mostly seen by small audiences accustomed to cinematic experimentalism. In this sense, his belief in art or independent film's potential for social impact cannot avoid what Rancière described as, and I quote, the aesthetic cut that separates outcomes from intentions. So still, Quispe Alarcón's highly specific and alternative generational portrait, his understanding of the everyday as both a critical and aesthetic category, his film's challenge of mainstream habits of spectatorship, and finally, his faith that cinema, like all art, and I quote his own words, when it is free, frees. When it is independent, brings about independence. This is certainly inspiring. So now Sarah will talk about her own chapter.
Thank you. Let me just see. Yeah. Thank you so much, Cynthia. So my chapter is about the work of a director who's based outside Lima, who's defied expectation, I guess, by achieving some degree of international recognition on the festival circuit. Amongst other aspects of his body of films, I highlight the distinctive aesthetics of slowness and austerity that this director, Omar Forero, deploys to articulate the impact of neoliberalism on a region of Peru that has largely been neglected by filmmakers. So one of the distinctive features of 21st century Peruvian cinemas, we argue, is the greater visibility of films made outside Lima. Small but significant numbers of these have secured festival screenings, have won funding awards, and have received critical acclaim. Omar Forero, born in Lima, but long based in the northwestern city of Trujillo in the coastal desert department of La Libertad, is one notable example. His third feature, Chicama, in 2012, secured state funding and won 5 awards at the Lima Film Festival, and was voted by national film critics to be the best Peruvian film of that year. His subsequent feature project, Casos Complejos, received a state funding award as well, a premiere screening at that same festival, and slots on the national, commercial, and global festival exhibition circuit. So it cut across the local, the global, the commercial, and the festival circuits. My chapter explores Forero's work as a case study through which to challenge the binarism of the concept of a Peruvian regional cinema that has tended in the past to set marginalized filmmaking communities sort of against a Lima-based norm in a way that underplays perhaps the wide range of different approaches taken by these regional filmmakers, as well as the quality of their work. I try to contend that Forero's cinematic response to neoliberalism, the realist aesthetics of his work, and its uncertain place in terms of market dynamics means that his films defy any easy categorization. So while we were trying to categorize in this book, we were also very mindful that many of our examples kind of cut through these categories. Since the mid-1990s, low-budget productions have been shot in almost all the regions of Peru. According to scholars and critics Emilio Bustamante and Jaime Luna Victoria, there emerged 2 broad types of cinema from across the vast swathe of the nation outside of Lima. One type focuses, they argue, on the production of feature films that combine mythical characters, oral tradition, and contemporary themes with the conventions of genre cinema, and which is aimed at a local mass audience. The other is a form of auteur cinema, taking influences from global independent filmmaking, aimed at national and international festival spectators. In both cases, exhibition at national level through the commercial circuit is virtually impossible. And where it's achieved, that circuit is normally restricted to screens in Lima-based multiplexes and cinemas in the region of the origin of the filmmaker, where those exist. Forero's realist aesthetics and his worldview, which unveils some of the challenging consequences of neoliberalism and honours the spirit of humanity, aligns rather with the conventions of a contemporary global auteur, described by Jonas van Nisky as combining philosophical reflection with political observation along with cinematographic artistry. His films have satisfied, more or less, the expectations of most of the Peruvian critics, garnering positive reviews and appearing on many end-of-year lists of films that have impressed them the most with their combination of innovation, stories, themes, characters that shine a wry light directly on provincial Peruvian life and the consequences of neoliberalism. They use primarily, as I've said, realist techniques, tableau sequences, and effective character development as representational modes through which to draw attention to some of the key challenges that have faced Peruvian cinema and society over recent decades. Forero's trajectory as a filmmaker included a period away from Peru during the 1990s while in his 20s, escaping the immediate economic and political turmoil of the Shining Path era that became dominated by a government regime that brought increasing restrictions to freedom of expression and limited the opportunities for most young Peruvians, especially those with creative ambitions. While he was in California, he made several short films that attracted state and other support for his first feature projects. Alongside developing his directorial career, he moved into production and exhibition, establishing his own company in Trujillo in the north, running 5 editions of the Festival X of independent video in the city, and running cinema workshops there, so cutting across all of the areas. The feature film which marked him out was his third, Chicama, released in 2012. It had won the very first project development prize for regional filmmakers that was administered by CONACINE, the government agency for supporting cinema at that time, as well as a funding award from the Global Film Initiative administered in the United States. The director also secured the contributions and expertise of Lima-based filmmaker Hector Galvez as executive producer and as editor of this film, while the well-established Lima-based company Guarango Films managed the colour and mastering elements of the post-production phase. These notes all serve to indicate the extent to which Forero had become well regarded amongst and integrated into the Peruvian filmmaking scene. In terms of exhibition, Chicama became made a strong national impact. It was screened at the main Lima Film Festival and won 5 prizes there. It was named, as I've said before, as the best Peruvian film of the year, the first time that a film made outside Lima had been recognised by the influential group of critics. It secured a modest screening tour in some of the country's mainstream commercial movie theatres and was then selected to represent Peru in the Goya Awards for Hispanic Films in 2013. All these achievements serve as indicators of a relatively significant critical and commercial success for a low-budget feature made outside of the capital city, at a distance from the metropolitan bubble. The plot of Chicama takes in Cesar, a young man who lives in the small rural village of Cascas, and the image here is just on the left-hand side, as you can see. We can't see Cesar, but we can see the environment in which he was working in the end. He graduated from Teacher Training College and has hit an impasse in his life. When he applies for a job as a teacher in Trujillo, the lack of vacancy means he ends up forced to accept a position in a tiny mountain village where life follows the same pattern, shaped by agricultural ritual, school routine, such as the one we see here, domestic daily chores, and communal viewing of telenovelas. Cesar is thus forced to move away from the modernity of Trujillo and towards the apparent isolation of a seemingly abandoned community. And his story offers a contemplation on the tribulations faced by many young Peruvians in the provinces where ambitions were thwarted. The film works towards awakening within him an appreciation for nature, tradition, and community, emphasizing the young protagonist's increasing awareness of the value of landscape around him. Chicama is largely a response to Forero's own concern about youth and lack of opportunity in the region of La Libertad. The importance of education in terms of personal development and social transformation is highlighted through the classroom scenes, which show Cesar's efforts to empower the children in his charge to create a life for themselves away from delinquency. Forero's work reveals a commitment to exploring the power of cinema as mirror on society and as a mechanism for creating awareness about issues of broad social concern. His subsequent feature, shown briefly on the right, Casos Complejos, out in 2019, draw more explicitly on the contemporary context of crisis, scandal, and abandonment in the provincial Peruvian justice system, tackling a contemporary issue, insecurity and social disorder caused by a rise in youth crime. It offers an effective social critique of the police and legal authorities in Peru based on records of actual investigations undertaken by the Office for Complex Cases in the region of La Libertad between 2013 and 2015. For Forero, cinema of all formats and genres offers, and I quote him, the possibility to present ourselves and to know ourselves as Peruvians, to represent and reflect ourselves. His characters are marked by isolation and estrangement, and his cinema has become a search for alternatives, as well as a form of resistance to the expectations of Peruvian national cinema of the 21st century. Over to Cynthia.
Okay, just to finalize some concluding words. So among the conclusions that we arrived at while preparing the book, I would like to highlight the concepts referred to in our collection's subtitle. dynamic and unstable grounds. So we identified dynamism and instability as the overarching features that characterize Peruvian cinema today. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, film culture in Peru has grown exponentially, it has decentered, and it has diversified. It now spans from market-oriented products and processes in the commercial and the art film sectors to different forms of independent, experimental, and community-based filmmaking. In addition, first steps have been taken towards greater equality as many more women are now working as filmmakers, festival organizers, critics, educators, academic researchers, and policymakers in increasingly important roles. So this is about dynamism, right? So nevertheless, a defining feature of Peruvian cinema is its underlying fragility. In a similar way to how the current pandemic has disrupted that long-held fantasy of the country's economic takeoff, and this is shown in our book cover. That's why we picked this image of the takeoff of a plane in the airport that is framed with the ruins of the building of a community that was destroyed to expand the airport. This is an image from the film A Punto de Despegar by Lorena Best. So in the same way as that fantasy of the country's takeoff has been sort of broken, right? Film production and exhibition in Peru is still haunted by an underlying precarity that constitutes the main source of its instability. So a persistent lack of infrastructure, the unequal distribution of scarce resources among different forms of filmmaking, and the prevailing inefficiency of cultural and cinematic policy and legislation constrains the possibility of a solid, diversified, but also more equal development. Going back to the ties between the cinematic production and the country's socioeconomic and political processes, this deficit is intimately linked to Peru's institutional precariousness, systemic corruption, and structural economic and political shortfalls. Peru, for example, lags behind some of its regional neighbors by still not having a holistic institutional infrastructure to provide a stimulating environment for the consolidation of its cinema culture. For example, until little more than a year, cinema in Peru functioned under an obsolete film law created in the 1990s. That is, before the digital revolution had substantially impacted many aspects of film production and exhibition. It was only at the end of 2019 that the country managed to approve a widely criticized emergency decree, but this legislation falls short of an integral view of cinema that considers the interdependence of all aspects of the cinematic cycle. For example, 82% of the annual budget that the state allocates for cinema goes to producing films, while only 17% is used to promote films and secure their release in theaters. And a mere 1% is allotted for the training of filmmakers and crew. Most important though, not much is being done to address what is still the greatest challenge for Peruvian cinema, which is developing a national audience. This is a problem that Peru shares with other Latin American countries. In addition, the lack of a public film school continues to be a persistent impediment to the development of a robust cinematic culture in Peru. An adequately financed public film school could further democratize filmmaking in the country and perhaps even open up a necessary space of reflection on the role of cinema in society. Adding to all these difficulties, the pandemic caused a real labor cataclysm. Postponed films, laid off workers, and all kinds of festivals or events moved to the virtual realm had devastating effects on those working in the sector. However, the general expansion of film culture in Peru over the last 20 years through unprecedented film production, festivals, alternative venues, and modes of exhibition online magazines, blogs, television programs, and podcasts has found ways to continue even during the pandemic. A very positive aspect in the midst of this difficult situation is the fact that, as local critic Monica Delgado has stated, online circulation and viewing has remarkably decentered the discussion and exhibition of Peruvian cinema. So film not only has been able to reach more viewers, both in Peru and abroad, that allowed by Zoom, right? Or Facebook Live, but it has done so in events that include discussions with Q&A sessions with a high level of audience participation, much more than it has usually happened in in-person events. Live broadcasts, such as those of the film Hugo Blanco Rio Profundo, which reached 5,000 people, followed by a conversation with the audience that had more than 38,000 reproductions, or successful re-releases on Vimeo, such as that of La Revolución y la Tierra, are proof of a vitality that is finding new possibilities to continue to connect with the public. So we are yet to see what goes on as the pandemic in Peru right now continues, because it's only intensifying, but eventually, as hopefully it will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Cynthia. I think you succeeded us in giving us a fantastic sense of the really impressive scope of this book, the different kinds of cinematic production that it's focusing on, but also the diversity of different approaches taken in the chapters, both from different disciplinary perspectives, but also working from different theoretical frameworks as well. I have lots of questions that's generated in me, but I also want to open up to others who I'm sure are going to have comments and questions as well. But while everyone else is gathering their thoughts, I shall jump in with the first question. Lots of things that interest me there, but one of the things in particular was this sort of burst of a more regional cinema. And I wondered what you felt was driving that. Is this an interest in redefining national imaginaries, perhaps paying greater attention to rural traditions and experiences? Does it connect with a turn to the rural in some other Latin American cinemas? Because it sounds as though a quest to open up new markets within the nation by locating filmmaking in other regions. It doesn't sound as though that's a successful marketing strategy yet, or is what's driving it the fact that there are perhaps some new opportunities for filmmakers in regions outside Lima now that there weren't before? I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about what you felt was driving that new phenomenon.
Yeah, maybe I can just say something from a kind of more structural perspective, but I'm sure Cynthia will have something more from the kind of Peruvian perspective. I mean, it is extremely structural in that the film legislation and funding and policy that was kind of set up and then abandoned and then sort of reprised and so on had very recently a new sort of section for regional filmmakers. And that has really energized or brought to the fore and made visible filmmaking that was already happening. So I think what we kind of have to acknowledge that it's not necessarily a new thing. A lot of people were making cinema, making films in all sorts of different ways, but it's about the visibility of that and putting it into the market. I suppose that's where our book is trying to say that there are ways in which this cinema has just become more known, both nationally, locally and internationally in lots of different ways. And so through our categories, I think we've got, apart from the first category, but through our other categories, we do have kind of so-called regional films that kind of cut across those areas. And there was, I think I very briefly mentioned that Omar Forero was the first recipient of an award from the state funding scheme that was specifically for regional filmmakers. So it was kind of marked out as something new, something branded, something for filmmakers based outside of Lima. And even though he was from Lima, he had by then kind of based himself in Trujillo for many years, was working there, was based there, and was able to sort of be a bona fide, very much a recipient of that. So I genuinely think that it is a very structural thing as to how it's become more visible. There's of course something much deeper than that, and I think that's also what you're driving at. But I'll let Cynthia sort of perhaps address those points, if that's okay, around the kind of broader culture of the regional notion.
Well, one of the interesting things that I've been noticing lately when watching regional films is how much they want to emphasize the provinces as urban centers. They don't want to emphasize the rural. They want to show their cities, the way they film the cities. I've seen a couple of films from Huancayo lately, and they are, the way they start with these shots of the cities at night and all the lights, very urban shot, right? The way they focus on skateboarding culture in Trujillo, or different types of urban topics that are coming from the provinces in order to say, hey, Lima is not just the only city in Peru. So that's interesting, because in a parallel sort of way as to other films like Huina y Pacha, which was a success in the international film circuit, which is a film very focused on rural life, right? And isolation. There's also this push towards acknowledging and showing the urban nature of the rest of Peru in order to defy the stereotypes of, it's Lima and then the Andes, right? Or the Amazon. So I would like to emphasize that. Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. Gives a nuance, I guess, to some of that idea of the regional cinema.
Exactly.
Yeah, Ollie, you had a question.
Yeah, it probably goes more towards Cynthia's section, but if you both want to talk about it, that also works. So thank you. I found that really, really interesting. I was particularly thinking about sort of third section of the book, and with your essay on film and filmmakers who try to place their works outside the sphere of commodification. And sort of an immediate point of reference seems to me to be the Nuevo Cine Latinoamericano from the 60s and 70s. And I was just wondering how you might articulate that relationship, whether you see it as a point of continuation, what the differences might be, and whether this is just discursive or is actually material as well.
Sure. Actually, one of the sections of my chapter explores, both the influence of the new Latin American cinema on Quispe Alarcon's ideas about the role of film, but also the way he distances from it. So I didn't have time to bring it up because I had to choose just one or two sections of my chapter, but I knew, and I'm glad that the question came up, because now it's giving me a chance to at least point out, the little things, but it's an obvious connection, right? The first thing you think is, okay, this guy is sort of the reincarnation of what they were trying to do in the 60s, right? So there is several points of contact between his ideas about film and those of the new Latin American cinema movement, particularly in terms of the ideals of absolute coherence between art and life that the filmmakers from that period sort of so much and militantly, advocated for, and Quispe Alarcón, right? If I may read you a very, very small quote from Quispe Alarcón that I quote in that section of the book, right? For example, and it's a very powerful quote. For me, film is transversal. That is, encompasses all aspects of our lives. Not only is it our way of making a living, of earning some money, of socially stratifying ourselves, of looking for recognition, it is transversal. That is, every molecule of oxygen of our body relates to film. Every way of doing films is cinematic. Every viewpoint, every word, every position we take is a form of activism, isn't it? And it's a little outrageous that when we talk about cinema in Peru, we talk about marketing, advertising campaigns, economic advantages, etc. For me, that is absurd. So this absolute coherence between art and life, right? The militance is one of the points of contact. The other one is sort of the decolonizing mission of cinema, decolonizing the imagination from all these mandates of capitalism, and also the call for the committed artists and intellectuals, right? But then the distance that he takes from this movement is essentially, he distances himself from this Marxist Leninist orthodoxy from the filmmakers of that period, especially from their collective project of political uprising at the continental level. You know, they were thinking more in terms of really generating a revolution, a political revolution. And Quispe Alarcón is much more of an anarchist that talks about liberating the individual from, you know, it's much more, I guess, a 21st century subject, right? He understands liberation much more away from this sort of very strong belief in the power of the masses that the filmmakers of the new Latin American cinema had. That's not what he's thinking. So I hope I have answered the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. That was really interesting. There's a couple of questions from Raul in the chat panel, which I'm going to read out, which I think might extend the conversation that we've been heading into. So he says, I wonder how neoliberal governmentality operates at the level of film narratives. For instance, is the discourse of individual self-improvement, which is central to governmentality, expressed in the themes and aesthetics of films sponsored by the state? Also, it seems that the films of Eduardo Quispe Alarcón challenge this notion of self-improvement, especially in relation to the entrepreneurial spirit. I wonder how his films have been received, especially in a context like Peru, where migration from the Andes to Lima is a sign of entrepreneurship itself, as Carlos Franco suggests in La Otra Modernidad. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to respond to there, Cynthia, to extend what you were talking about in relation to Quispe Alarcón, or anything else in relation to that, those themes of discourses of governmentality of neoliberalism.
Yeah, well, the sort of the internalization of the mandates to be an entrepreneur of yourself is very much showcased in some films, especially like festival films that have been received funding from the state. You know, starting from La Teta Asustada, right? The family of Fausta. What does it represent, right? The triumph of this sort of very small family wedding company that, you know, that has sort of allowed them to become sort of an emerging middle class, and that allows them to have some sort of status and consumer capacity, right? That contrasts with Fauta's constant claim of remembering and of going towards the past. So the discourse of achievement, of economic achievement, always replaces memory, right? It's the antidote to the triumph of the nation that sort of erases the memory of the traumatic past. So in that film, for example, but there's many other films. El Evangelio de la Carne, for example, features a character that completely embodies this sort of participatory subject, right? There's several of them. So that might point to answering that question. And of course, the one that most does it is the most successful film from all times in Peru, which is Asumare, no? Asumare's protagonist embodies, you know, the neoliberal Peruvian who comes from, the low-class neighborhood in Peru and marries the upper-class limeña white, right? Because he has a successful career as a comedian. So most of the commercial films actually present that type of character. And that's precisely what Quispe Alarcón was reacting against, because he represented most of the young people of provincial origins as emblematic of that new sense of citizenship. And he kind of wanted to counteract, if that's the word, right? That representation. I forgot exactly what the second question was in terms of Quispe Alarcón, but if you remind me, I can answer. Or
I mean, I think you've touched on both parts of the question, actually. So that sounds great to me. Really interesting response. Is it Neil or Adriana who has the hand up? Adriana, go for it.
Hi, sorry, I'm Adriana. I'm not Neil, but I'm connected through Neil's laptop here. Thank you for these brilliant presentations. My question is about the role of memory. You explained that memory sits at the core of the films, which are in the section for film festivals. Is that right? What's the role of memory in relation to the other types of films? I remember a while ago in LASA, actually a couple of years ago, hearing Peruvian colleagues saying that memory, like that many films, especially grassroots films and like common everyday telenovelas, for example, try to push away memories of the conflict as a way of moving on. I come from Argentina, where everyone talks about memory, especially in the villas. So I was just curious about how you regard that, how you see that.
mm-hmm. Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah, I can say a few things. So yeah, you're quite right that it predominates the kind of the festival work for sure. It comes through loud and clear and continues to do so. But it also comes through in contemporary documentary cinema, just constantly. So films by Malena Martega are just all about different kinds of memory. So the film on Hugo Blanco, for example, is a much deeper memory about revolution and about identity, and the impact on her, but the impact on Peruvian society. But there's also many films that's kind of, I guess, the reason why we wanted to also embrace very much the more commercial side of things, which do not want to acknowledge that aspect of things as well. There's the kind of desmemoria, there's the anti-memoria, there's the here and now, which is as much part of the cultural products and practices and kind of what's received by many Peruvians as elsewhere. And I think going back to that question about regional cinema, much of which has been sort of going on in the background in regional cinema has been in effect a reaction against. It's been genre cinema, it's been the Western, it's been the horror. Obliquely, one could say it's also to do with memory, but also pushing against that, either going back to tradition, but also just kind of embracing the Western style genres, and just wanting to kind of look at new styles of contemporary storytelling. And I think where Cynthia was just talking about the notion of the contemporary on the urban, on the cosmopolitan, on the future. That's really what we found so much in much of the newer cinema of Peru. So we kind of, I guess we sort of touched at the surface of that in some of our films, but I think, you know, a next stage, the next decade is really where that cinema will be. But I have to say, I think, to be honest, personally, I think this notion of memory in cinema is not going away. It's really embedded in kind of everything that has to do with culture, society, politics in cinema. So there might be a push against, but there's also a deep-rooted kind of desire for culture to do that job.
if I may add, in our epilogue, we mentioned 3 films that were the biggest sources of success that we didn't have time to cover because they came out after we had already submitted our manuscript to the publisher, right? And of these 3 films, 2 have to do with memory. One of them is a documentary, La Revolución y la Tierra, which is a look back from the millennial generation into the agrarian revolution of the 1960s. And it's a very interesting work on memory, but it's also a reflection of film as a way of political activism. And then the other film the other recent major success of Peruvian film that, as I said, we covered we mentioned in our epilogue, is Canción Sin Nombre, which again is a film about it's located, the story is located in the 80s about a woman whose a baby is robbed after giving birth. And it brings about a huge case that was in the 80s about the traffic of babies taken away from indigenous mothers. So again, it's in different ways, in fiction film, in documentary, the subject is still there, right?
I wanted to ask you something about the framing of the book. In your summary of why you've structured the book in the way that you have, you make a link between what you call the interplay between film production and market forces on the one hand, and the dynamism of contemporary cinema culture in Peru, but also its instability. I was just wondering about the nature of that link. Is a dynamic cinema culture in this case conditional, do you think, on its subjection to market forces in this way? Could state subsidies at a more significant level actually not also create a dynamic cinema that was less unstable? I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that link that you perceived that underpins the way that you've structured the book.
Mm-hmm. If you want, I can start and then you continue, Sarah. Basically, it is very obvious that because of the country's economic and sort of political recovery after the 20 years of war, right? Its insertion into the financial network of economic and in a way the unprecedented growth in the Peruvian middle class, right? And the obvious economic growth of Peru has allowed for cinema culture to flourish. If it wasn't for neoliberalism, in a way, it wouldn't have, right? At the same time, the fact that the state has sort of marketed itself and started to work on its international image through projects like Marca Peru, for example, right? Cinema is part of that. Cinema is one of these products for export that Peru wants to promote itself with. Not only as a producer of film, but also it wants to become a location for filmmaking. So again, that also explains the dynamism, right? And that also explains why the state has started to create institutions to allocate some funding. Now, these are very, very limited still. And the way they are done is very conflictive. So that's why of this, the idea of the fragility, but the fragility is more linked towards the fact that even though the first decade of the 21st century was a decade of a relative political stability and economic growth, the second one was when everything went down. And if you're familiar with what has been happening in Peru in the last year, it's a chaotic landscape of political instability. So all the institutions of the state constantly change leadership. There's no funding. There's no continuity. So that is basically the source of the fragility, because even though there was an initial push, right, to sort of that had to do with economic growth, the political upheaval of Peru, which is getting worse by the day, right? It's what really makes everything very fragile. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, you've done it brilliantly, and I don't think I can add much except to say that even when there was that kind of rhetoric around kind of growth and growing stability, it felt like it was based on very, as we say, kind of fragile foundations, and that it was a macro growth and not one that was borne out on a kind of micro basis amongst society. So yeah, I remember having a conversation with colleagues I was working with on a project a few years ago, where they were pushing against some stuff. Yeah, it was just a conversation around this kind of whole situation about, yeah, but Peru is kind of, its economic growth is doing really well. It's really not on the ground. There's a kind of, yeah, as with many countries, there's a kind of rhetoric externally facing, and then there's a reality on the ground, and that reality on the ground is what's coming through now. So yeah.
Thank you. Neil, is that your hand this time, or is it Adriana's again?
No, it's my hand this time. Yeah, thank you both for a great presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. But I was thinking about this dynamic you've set up about thinking about markets and capitalism, which is excellent. I was just wondering if, and maybe it's a bit tangential, but if you had any sort of thoughts about illicit markets or informal markets and their relationship to cinema circulation in Peru. I was thinking about the piracy might feed into the dynamics you're talking about.
Yeah, slightly lost you there, Neil, but yeah, I mean, the illicit, the informal market for sure, for many years has been so important for the circulation of films. You know, not even kind of piracy, just a sort of a general, I'm sure it's the same in many parts of the world, where just another circulation format for DVDs, for example, not great quality, but in Lima, there's a fantastic, if anybody's been to Lima and knows this, there's a kind of fantastic space in the market where actually the directors, they kind of almost give their blessing to this particular kind of alleyway in the market where you can go and buy bootleg copies. And they might have signed some, and it might be actually part of the release. And it's the only probably kind of bootleg area that they will support, and it's a little bit of a celebrity space in and of itself. So I think, yeah, that's a whole other project, I think, and I'm sure other people have got their eye on that project. But yeah, it's a chapter not yet written, let's say, but it is important, and I think several of us, you know, Cynthia and myself, kind of just make a nod to that in our chapters. So Polvos Azules gets its mention in the book for sure.
I was wondering about Indigenous filmmaking, whether you could say a little bit more about that, and whether that participates in existing circuits, the main ones that you described, or whether it creates its own audiences, its own circuits, which might even be transnational, you know, with the kinds of networks that have been established between Indigenous filmmakers in different nations, perhaps in Latin America.
Yes. Indigenous filmmaking, which is mostly community filmmaking, has this very, very alternative circulation venues, right? Basically because they couldn't even aspire to be shown in mainstream theaters, because not even the award-winning art films are showcased there. So imagine the Indigenous filmmaking they will never be shown there. So they circulate mostly in, there's an incredible amount of Indigenous local film festivals throughout Latin America. And so, yeah, their circulation is mostly transnational, but it's also online because of that, right? But there's also, before the pandemic, there were sort of several festivals that were in person that brought together indigenous filmmakers from different parts of Latin America. So I wonder how it's, if the pandemic is going to make the online realm even more powerful, or whether we're gonna go back to, I don't know, to in person.
That would be very interesting to see. Yeah, whether it creates new forms of visibility and platforms.
In that sense, the good thing about it, as I said in my concluding works, is that so many more people, for example, that are not necessarily or cannot travel to go and see a film festival in Huancayo on indigenous cinema, can connect and see it. And so it's a very, very strong way of opening up not only participation, but also just awareness, because so many people didn't even know lots of little local film festivals existed, and now they know about it and they can see them, they can participate on them. So.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments from anyone? Or anything else that you would like to say, Sarah and Cynthia, to leave us with?
Oh, thank you. Just huge thank you for giving us this platform for Peruvian cinema, really. It's great to have questions about not just the kind of the more well-known Peruvian films, I guess, but one of the things we were really, really trying to do with this book was to open up a sense of the diversity. So I hope we kind of managed to land that message. I'm sure you already knew that anyway. Kind of, I can see that there are kind of very, kindred spirits on the line here today, which is wonderful. But just really to sort of demonstrate that, yes, we see a tiny, we have in the past, as Cynthia was saying, been allowed to see a tiny slice of the sorts of films that would go out to festivals, the Claudiosa films, those that were sort of already pre-selected for our eyes. And now we're actually, there's no excuse. We can go and delve in and find and actually have hitting our Facebook pages if we really kind of are not even too lazy to find those other sorts of cinema. So yeah, just say please go and enjoy yourselves with a wide range of Peruvian cinemas.
Great.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, get your libraries to buy the book, the ebook. Any promo discounts available?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Anybody who needs a promo discount, just let us know.
Right, that sounds like a good invitation to me.
Yeah, definitely. And the Spanish version, for anybody who prefers that, will be coming out hopefully towards the end of this year, if not early next. Cynthia in particular has done an amazing job at creating the translation of the work with Universidad de Lima Press. So yeah, we hope to have that out soon to make it more accessible.
Fantastic. That's really good news. Congratulations on that version to come, as well as the one that is already out. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Really interesting, touched on so many different aspects of Peruvian cinema. I think we've all learned a lot. Yeah, if you want to do any virtual clapping or even unmute yourself and do some real clapping, now is the moment. So thank you both, and yeah, good luck with your next publishing projects.
Thank you, Joanna. You too, and thank you for hosting us. Thank you,
No
everybody,
problem.
for being here. It's really, really nice to be in your company. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.